The fluorescent lights flickered above the crowded courtroom, casting a sterile glow on the polished wood benches. Everyone seemed restless that morning, waiting for the judge to arrive. At the defendant's table sat a young black teenager named Leah, barely 17, her posture stiff but her eyes unwavering. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair tied neatly back, as if determined to present herself with dignity, despite the weight of the situation. The bailiff announced, "All rise," and Judge Meredith Caldwell entered. Known for her sharp tongue and icy demeanor, she carried herself like the room belonged solely to her. The gavel struck, and silence followed. As the charges were read, a murmur spread through the audience. The case was minor, some dispute blown out of proportion, but Judge Caldwell's smirk revealed she already had her opinion formed. "Well," the judge began, her voice laced with condescension, "I see we have yet another one of you here today, a teenager who thinks the rules don't apply to her." She leaned back, scanning Leah from head to toe, her lips curling into a laugh. "What future could you possibly imagine for yourself, young lady? Don't tell me you think this court is your stage." The courtroom chuckled uneasily, some averting their eyes while others sneered in agreement with the judge's words. Leah didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly stood, her chin lifting with an air of quiet confidence. The laughter around her dimmed as her calm presence began to shift the atmosphere. "Your Honor," Leah said firmly, her voice steady despite the judge's mockery, "with all due respect, you have no idea who I am." The room stilled, and for the first time, Judge Caldwell's smirk faltered the silence after Leah's words stretched longer than expected. The judge's gavel tapped once, more out of irritation than control. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if daring the teenager to continue. "Who you are," the judge repeated mockingly. "You're a defendant in my courtroom. That's all that matters." Her tone cut through the room like a blade, and the spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Leah didn't waver. She took a slow breath, her hands resting lightly on the table before her. There was something about her presence, an authority beyond her years, that made even the bailiff glance at her with curiosity. Behind Leah, whispers stirred in the gallery. Some leaned closer to one another, murmuring. A few seemed to recognize her, but didn't dare speak it aloud. The tension grew heavier, like a storm building before the first clap of thunder. Her attorney, a weary public defender named Mr. Collins, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor," he began carefully, "perhaps we should allow Leah to—" "Sit down, Counselor," Judge Caldwell snapped, slamming the gavel again. "I don't run my courtroom based on teenage theatrics." Leah's jaw tightened, but her expression remained calm. She glanced briefly at the rows of people behind her, then back at the judge. "I'm not here for theatrics," she said softly, but every word carried weight. "I'm here because people think they know me when they don't. But if you insist on treating me like just another name on your docket, then maybe it's time I remind this court of who my family is." The room erupted in murmurs. Even the judge's face flickered with a flash of uncertainty, though she quickly masked it. Something was shifting. Leah was no ordinary teenager. Judge Caldwell straightened in her chair, her polished gavel resting firmly in her grip. "Enough games, young lady," she barked. "This is a courtroom, not a classroom debate." But Leah's calm gaze never faltered. She clasped her hands together, speaking clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "My last name is Carter. Leah Carter." The whispers in the gallery grew louder, some faces lit with sudden recognition, while others shifted nervously in their seats. The bailiff, usually stoic, stiffened slightly at the sound of her surname. Judge Caldwell arched an eyebrow. "And why should that mean anything to this court?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain, though her fingers tapped impatiently on the bench. Leah tilted her chin upward, her voice steady. "Because my mother is Judge Evelyn Carter." The courtroom froze. The same Judge Carter who had presided over some of the state's most high-profile cases, the same woman known for her fairness, brilliance, and unshakable presence in the legal world. Even Mr. Collins, Leah's attorney, blinked in shock. "Your mother is the Judge Carter," he whispered under his breath. Leah gave the faintest nod. "Yes, and she taught me more about justice than anyone in this room ever could." For the first time that morning, Judge Caldwell's confidence cracked. She shifted in her chair, adjusting her robe as murmurs rippled through the courtroom like wildfire. Leah's words weren't just a revelation, they were a challenge. Everyone could feel it. The young teenager who had been mocked moments earlier now stood as someone far greater than the court had assumed. Judge Caldwell cleared her throat, but the smirk that once lived on her face was gone. The room was no longer laughing. It was listening. The courtroom air felt heavier than before, as though every word spoken had tilted the balance of power. Judge Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, her fingers drumming against the wooden bench. She opened her mouth, then closed it, the silence betraying her usual dominance. Leah didn't rush to speak. She let the silence linger, knowing it spoke louder than any argument. People in the gallery leaned forward, anxious to catch every breath, every flicker of expression. Finally, the judge cleared her throat. "Judge Carter," she said with strained politeness, "is respected. But that doesn't excuse your behavior, Miss Carter. You stand accused, and this court will treat you like anyone else." Leah's lips curved into the faintest smile. "That's exactly what my mother always taught me, that the law applies equally. But, Your Honor, she also taught me to recognize when someone is using their position not for justice, but for ridicule." The words hit harder than anyone expected. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Mr. Collins, who had been nervously chewing on the edge of a pen, nearly dropped it. Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. "Are you suggesting I run this courtroom with bias?" Leah's calm tone carried an undeniable edge. "I'm not suggesting it, Your Honor. I'm saying it." A stunned hush swept across the room. The bailiff shifted awkwardly, torn between his duty and the realization that the teenager standing before the judge was no ordinary defendant. For a long moment, Caldwell sat frozen, her authority visibly cracking. Leah stood tall, unshaken, her voice having cut through the courtroom like a blade. For the first time in years, Judge Caldwell wasn't the one commanding the room. Leah was. Judge Caldwell's knuckles whitened as she gripped the gavel. She slammed it down hard, the crack echoing off the walls. "Order! I will not tolerate disrespect in my courtroom," she barked, though her voice betrayed a tremor. Leah didn't flinch. She simply raised her chin higher. "Respect is earned, Your Honor, not demanded through fear or mockery. You laughed at me before you even knew my name. That's not justice, it's prejudice." Gasps rippled again through the audience. People exchanged glances, some nodding silently in agreement. A man in the back row muttered, "She's right," loud enough to be heard. Mr. Collins tugged gently at Leah's sleeve, whispering, "Careful, Leah. You're pushing her too far." But Leah pulled her arm away softly and stepped forward. "I came here today prepared to accept responsibility for a misunderstanding, but what I won't accept is being humiliated because of who I am, or who you think I'm not." Judge Caldwell's composure continued to crumble, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting toward the gallery, as if worried about the impression being formed. The whispers had turned into a quiet current of support for Leah, the young teen standing boldly against authority. Finally, Caldwell exhaled sharply. "You think this court bends to your words because of your mother? Because of your last name?" Leah's voice was unwavering. "No, Your Honor. I don't need my mother's name to stand here. I stand on my own." Her words rang through the courtroom with such conviction that even the bailiff lowered his gaze, as though acknowledging her courage. For the first time, Judge Caldwell looked less like the authority in the room and more like the one being judged. The tension was so thick that even the air seemed harder to breathe. Judge Caldwell's gavel rested uselessly in her hand now, her authority slipping away with every word Leah spoke. The audience, once a passive collection of spectators, had become a jury of their own, their eyes locked on the unfolding confrontation. Leah stood tall, her voice steady but resolute. "You've been on this bench a long time, Judge Caldwell, but somewhere along the way you forgot what this bench is for. It's not a throne, it's a responsibility." Caldwell's cheeks flushed. "You dare lecture me?" "I don't dare," Leah answered calmly. "I choose to, because if I don't, who will? Every kid you've ever mocked, every person you've humiliated, they didn't have a voice. But I do." The murmurs in the gallery swelled. A few people clapped softly before being hushed by the bailiff. Even Mr. Collins, usually the atmosphere inside the courtroom was unlike anything it had ever held before. Judge Caldwell sat rigid, her jaw clenched, while Leah stood unwavering, her presence commanding more attention than the black robe on the bench. From the gallery, a voice suddenly broke the silence. An elderly woman, her voice quivering but strong, spoke out. "She's right. Too many times I've seen you mock folks who come in here scared and alone." The judge snapped her head toward the gallery. "Silence, or I'll clear this courtroom," Caldwell barked, but her voice cracked under the strain. Another voice followed, this time a middle-aged man in a work uniform. "We all seen it, Judge. Every time someone like Leah walks in here, you treat them like they're already guilty." The murmurs grew louder, voices overlapping, some angry, others emboldened. The bailiff stepped forward, trying to hush the crowd, but the tide had shifted. The people weren't afraid anymore. Leah didn't smile or gloat. Instead, she lifted her hand gently toward the gallery. "Please," she said, her voice calm but firm, "let's not turn this into chaos. This isn't about revenge. This is about truth." The room quieted again, the respect in her tone calming the unrest. Even those who spoke out sat back, their eyes fixed on her. Judge Caldwell slammed her gavel, but the sharp crack no longer commanded the room. "Miss Carter, this has gone far enough." Leah turned back to her, meeting her glare without hesitation. "No, Your Honor, this has gone far enough because of you. People are tired of being silenced, tired of being ridiculed, and today the silence broke." The judge froze, her authority shrinking under the weight of collective truth. For once, it wasn't Leah alone standing against her. It was the entire room. The gallery had found its voice, and Leah had given it permission to rise. And Judge Caldwell, for the first time in years, looked like the loneliest person in her own courtroom. Judge Caldwell leaned back in her chair, visibly shaken. The gavel rested in her palm, but she didn't strike it. The authority that once seemed untouchable now clung to her like a fragile mask. Leah stood steady, her voice calm but piercing. "You wanted to laugh at me because you thought I was small, but you forgot. My mother raised me in these halls of justice. I grew up watching trials from the back of her courtroom. I learned what fairness looked like, and what it didn't." The mention of Judge Evelyn Carter sent another ripple through the gallery. People exchanged glances, some nodding knowingly. Evelyn Carter was more than a name, she was a legend. Her rulings had shaped laws, her reputation built on a rare blend of compassion and steel. Judge Caldwell tried to regain her footing. "Evelyn Carter, yes, I remember her, but don't think for one moment that her reputation shields you." Leah shook her head. "I don't need her reputation to shield me. I stand here on my own merit. But let's not pretend you're unaffected by her name. She held this system accountable, and you hated her for it." The words struck like lightning. Caldwell's eyes flickered, a shadow of bitterness surfacing. The truth had been spoken aloud, and the courtroom knew it. A man in the gallery leaned forward. "So that's why you've been so hard on her," he muttered. "Because she's Carter's daughter." Caldwell's composure faltered further. Her lips parted, but no defense came out. Leah pressed forward. "You can try to humiliate me, but I carry my mother's lessons in every word I speak, and she taught me that justice is not about ego. It's about responsibility to the people, something you seem to have forgotten." The silence that followed was suffocating. The weight of Leah's words lingered in the air, undeniable, irreversible. Judge Caldwell had been cornered, not by power, not by threats, but by truth. And in that moment, Leah didn't just stand as a teenager before the court. She stood as her mother's shadow, casting light where darkness had long reigned. The courtroom felt different now. The gallery, once restless and afraid to speak, sat in tense silence. Every eye was fixed on Leah, who stood not as a defendant, but as a voice of defiance against injustice. The court reporter, a woman who had worked under countless judges, paused as her fingers hovered over the stenography machine. She had been typing every word, but now she looked up, her eyes meeting Leah's with quiet admiration. For years she had recorded cruel remarks, dismissive laughter, and heavy-handed rulings. Today, the record would reflect something different, a teenager standing her ground against a judge. "Miss Carter," Judge Caldwell said at last, her voice strained, "you are dangerously close to contempt of court." Leah did not flinch. "And you are dangerously close to showing the world who you really are." The audience murmured, some gasping at Leah's boldness. The bailiff shifted uneasily, glancing at Caldwell, then at Leah, unsure of whom to obey if the situation escalated. Judge Caldwell's face reddened. "You think this is some kind of game? That your words will undo years of law and order?" Leah's tone was sharp but steady. "Law and order are meaningless when the people enforcing them forget their purpose. You think justice is about fear, about belittling people to keep them small. But justice is about truth, and truth doesn't bow to your gavel." The court reporter's keys clicked rapidly as she captured every word, knowing history was being spoken. Even Mr. Collins, Leah's weary lawyer, stared at her with astonishment, as though seeing his client for the first time. Caldwell gripped the bench, her voice quivering despite her efforts to sound firm. "You will regret this arrogance." Leah stepped closer, her voice ringing through the chamber. "The only thing I regret is that people have sat in this courtroom for years, silenced by your arrogance. Today that silence ends. The room erupted, not in chaos but in thunderous applause. The bailiff raised his hands to restore order, but it was too late. The tide had turned, and the record now bore witness. Leah had broken the silence, and the court reporter ensured it would never be forgotten. The applause swelled, rolling through the courtroom like a storm that could no longer be contained. Judge Caldwell pounded her gavel furiously. "Order! I demand order in this court!" Her voice, once sharp and commanding, now sounded desperate. The more she tried to restore control, the clearer it became. She had lost it. The bailiff looked uncertain, his hand hovering over the crowd, but he didn't move to silence them. His eyes flicked toward Leah, and even he seemed reluctant to confront her. Leah waited for the clapping to fade, then spoke with measured calm. "This isn't about disrespecting the law, Your Honor. It's about reminding everyone here what justice should look like. A courtroom should not be a place of fear. It should be a place of fairness." Caldwell's hands trembled slightly as she set down the gavel. Her mask of superiority was slipping faster than she could hold it together. "You think you've humiliated me, Miss Carter," she spat bitterly. "But you're just a child, and children don't decide what justice is." Leah stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Maybe not, but when adults fail to honor justice, sometimes it takes a child to remind them." The gallery murmured again, louder this time. Caldwell's face twisted with anger, but her words faltered. You think your mother's shadow protects you? You think her name gives you the right to lecture me?" Leah cut her off, her tone like steel. "This isn't about my mother's name, it's about yours. Every person who leaves this courtroom will remember how you laughed at a teenager, mocked someone before hearing them, and tried to silence the truth. That will be your legacy." The words landed like a verdict. The judge's shoulders slumped, her glare melting into something closer to fear than authority. For the first time since she had taken the bench, Judge Caldwell realized the room no longer saw her as the figure of power. They saw Leah, the teenager who had exposed the cracks in the system. The courtroom was hers now, and Caldwell knew it. Judge Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For years she had ruled her courtroom through intimidation, but now her authority dangled by a thread. The gallery was no longer afraid, the bailiff no longer unquestioning. And Leah, the teenager she had mocked, now stood taller than her robe could make her. Just then, the courtroom doors opened. Heads turned as a woman in a navy suit stepped inside, her heels clicking against the floor with deliberate confidence. Gasps rippled through the room. Judge Evelyn Carter herself had arrived, Leah's mother. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Caldwell stiffened, her eyes widening before she quickly masked her reaction. Evelyn Carter was a name etched into the very foundation of the courthouse. To see her standing there in person was like seeing the embodiment of justice itself. "Proceed," Evelyn said calmly, her voice rich with authority, though she wasn't presiding. She stood at the back, arms folded, her eyes fixed on Caldwell. Leah's expression softened for a moment. She hadn't expected her mother, but the timing was perfect. Turning back to the bench, she continued, "You see, Your Honor, truth has a way of catching up. You laughed at me because you thought I was alone. I never was." Caldwell's voice shook as she tried to maintain composure. "This is irregular. Judge Carter has no authority here." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Authority isn't always about position, Meredith. Sometimes it's about presence. And right now, you're facing more than just a defendant. You're facing accountability." The gallery erupted in murmurs, emboldened by Evelyn's words. Caldwell gripped the bench, her robe heavy on her shoulders, as though it no longer fit her. Leah's final words of the moment cut through the noise. "Justice doesn't laugh at people. Justice listens. And today, you've shown this court who you really are." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in her career, Judge Caldwell wasn't feared, she was exposed. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people eager to witness the trial that had gripped the nation. Camera crews waited outside, their lenses focused on the courthouse doors, ready to broadcast every development. Inside, James sat at the defendant's table, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the judge. His attorney, Miss Carter, whispered last-minute reassurances, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. The prosecutor strode confidently to the jury, painting James as reckless and suspicious. A man carrying $10,000 in cash. Who does that? What honest citizen needs to move money like that in secret? His words echoed, and several jurors frowned. He hammered away at James's character, trying to sow doubt where none belonged. Then it was Miss Carter's turn. Rising gracefully, she carried herself with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what you've just heard is speculation, not fact. My client, James Walker, deposited his own money at his own bank. No law was broken, yet he was handcuffed, humiliated, and branded a criminal simply because of the color of his skin." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "The evidence will show he committed no crime. The truth will reveal that prejudice, not justice, drove his arrest." Whispers rippled across the courtroom. The judge's gavel struck once, restoring order, but the shift was undeniable. James felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest as Miss Carter presented documents proving the cash came from his property sale. Witnesses were lined up, ready to testify on his behalf. The prosecutor leaned back, visibly unsettled, as the jury began to look less convinced. For the first time since his arrest, James sensed the tide turning. But just as the judge called for a recess, a man in the back of the room stood up. His words cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Your Honor, I have evidence that changes." Every gasp filled the courtroom as the tall man in the back stepped forward. He was dressed in a crisp grey suit, his voice calm but commanding. "My name is Richard Hale," he announced. "I'm the regional director for First Federal Bank, the very branch where Mr. Walker deposited his money." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Hale, do you have evidence relevant to this case?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, holding up a thick folder. "These are the internal bank reports, surveillance footage, and transaction records that prove Mr. Walker's deposit was legitimate. More importantly, they reveal misconduct by the arresting officers." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged the gavel furiously until silence returned. James's heart raced as Hale was sworn in. He opened the folder and placed several photographs and documents on the evidence table. The footage played on the courtroom screen. It showed James calmly walking into the bank, filling out his deposit slip and handing it to the teller. No disturbance. No wrongdoing. The next clip showed the officers storming in, roughly grabbing him without explanation. Murmurs of outrage spread among the spectators. Miss Carter's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. Can you explain why these records were not made available earlier?" Hale nodded gravely. "Because someone in law enforcement deliberately tried to suppress them. When I discovered this, I knew it had to come to light." The prosecutor paled, shuffling his papers nervously. His argument was crumbling. James sat frozen, hardly believing what he was hearing. All the humiliation, the fear, the endless doubt, it had been for nothing but prejudice and corruption. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "This trial has taken a very serious turn. We will reconvene after reviewing this evidence." As court adjourned, every eye turned to James. For the first time, he wasn't seen as a suspect. He was seen as a man fighting for justice. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever the next morning. Journalists lined the aisles, cameras flashing as James and Miss Carter took their seats. Whispers ran through the gallery. Everyone knew the suppressed evidence had changed everything. The judge entered, her face stern. She cleared her throat. After reviewing the evidence provided by Mr. Hale and considering the testimony presented, this court has reached a decision. James's hands trembled beneath the table. Miss Carter placed a steadying hand over his. The judge continued, "Mr. James Walker, the charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go." The gavel struck. The courtroom erupted in applause, gasps, and a few angry shouts from the prosecution's side. James sat frozen for a moment, unable to process the words. Free, finally free. Miss Carter rose, smiling with quiet triumph. "Justice served," she whispered, but the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, an investigation will be launched into the officers involved in Mr. Walker's unlawful arrest and the attempted suppression of evidence. This court does not tolerate corruption or discrimination. The officers in question paled, their careers flashing before their eyes. James finally stood, tears stinging his eyes as he turned to face the crowd. "I came here today expecting more humiliation, but instead I was reminded that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way out." The room fell silent at his words. Even the judge's stern expression softened. As James left the courtroom, the same people who had once doubted him now looked at him with respect. Outside, sunlight streamed across the courthouse steps. Miss Carter walked beside him, saying, "This is only the beginning. Your story will change more lives than you know." James inhaled deeply. For the first time since his nightmare began, he believed her. Justice had finally spoken.